Welcome back to episode 5 of The Critical Edition, a bookish podcast where we explore literature and media and provide analysis through a critical lens. We are your hosts, Soha and
Jasmine.
In this episode, we will be discussing Sonny's Blues, a short story by none other than James Baldwin. Centrally, this is a character-driven story that follows the relationship between two brothers over time, examining the way that distance and suffering impact their bond. Don't worry if you haven't read it. We're going to talk through it very slowly, step by step, considering how historical context and Baldwin's life enriches the story. We'll also draw out meaningful themes that really stuck with us. And by the end of this episode, if you haven't read it already, I'm sure that you will want to. And we will link down below where you can read this for free.
James Baldwin was born in 1924 in Harlem, New York. He grew up in a big household led by his mother and stepfather, who was a strict and abusive preacher.
He's also the grandson of enslaved people, and that's something that he really contends with within his writing and within his worldview.
He never knew his biological father, and as the oldest child in a large family, he felt a deep sense of responsibility and often helped care for his younger siblings. As a teenager, Baldwin became deeply involved in the church, and from the ages of 14 to 17, he preached at a Pentecostal assembly. And though this period in his life shaped his sense of moral urgency, it also played a major role in his eventually leaving the church. In 1944, Baldwin met Richard Wright, one of the most prominent Black writers of the time. Wright became like a mentor of sorts to Baldwin and helped him secure a fellowship to work on his first novel. That opportunity actually allowed Baldwin to leave the United States in 1948 and settle in Paris. At just 24 years old, he left the United States. He felt that he had no choice but to leave the United States, as he was tired and worn down by the constant racism and homophobia that he faced daily as an openly gay Black man. Harlem in particular had become unsafe. He said he was being frequently harassed and beaten by both local youth groups and the police. From then on, he ultimately spent most of his life living in Europe, but he never fully disconnected from the United States. He often returned and referred to himself as a transatlantic commuter. These visits back and forth allowed him to remain close to his big family and to also take part in key moments of the civil rights movement. Baldwin died in France in 1987 from stomach cancer, and he was later buried in New York.
And some of you might be super familiar with Baldwin's work already, but if not, he wrote Giovanni's Room, he wrote Notes of a Native Son, he wrote Nobody Knows My Name, The Fire Next Time, and he was a really prolific writer, but not only that, a speaker. He gave public debates and he was really connected in community. And we're so lucky to have so many of his interviews recorded and taped for free to access on places like YouTube. And I would strongly recommend that people watch those if you haven't already. I mean, they're so compelling and so moving. He's as good of a writer as he is debater and speaker. And I think that situating Baldwin's life within the historical context that he lived in is so important in understanding the place from which he wrote. So let's talk a little bit more about the historical context of when he was writing.
James Baldwin's life and writing are really closely connected to the Great Migration. And the Great Migration was like this huge movement that happened roughly from the 1920s to the 50s, when over 6 million African Americans left the South and moved to cities in the North, the Midwest, and also the West, trying to escape Jim Crow and racial violence. A lot of these families ended up in Harlem, which eventually became the largest Black community in the United States. And because so many people with similar experiences were living together, Harlem turned into a place where Black culture really flourished. Writers, artists, and musicians shared their ideas. They collaborated on work that really focused on Black identity, Black pride, and connections to African or Pan-African heritage. And this creative boom would be known as the Harlem Renaissance, and it helped reshape how Black Americans saw themselves in art and literature, but it would also plant the seeds for the civil rights movement later on. And I'm saying all of this because this history is deeply personal to Baldwin. His mother was part of the Great Migration. She settled in Harlem and raised her family there. Baldwin grew up after the Harlem Renaissance had passed, but its influence was still everywhere. He was connected to northern Black communities, but he also understood the pain and fear that had pushed his family north in the first place. The Harlem Renaissance also helped seed the civil rights movement, which, as you know, sought to end segregation and to grant equal rights for Black Americans across the country. Some major moments include the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education ruling, which ruled that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. And this all culminated with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which banned racial discrimination and protected voting rights for Black Americans. And Baldwin was such an important voice during all of this. He was writing during this time, about this time, and was influenced by this time. He met with leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy and spoke openly about racism. But at the same time, he wasn't afraid to point out the limits of the civil rights movement and question whether or not the United States was really changing.
Yeah, so the time period in which Baldwin was writing was really situated between Jim Crow and then this civil rights movement. And I think that's a really important frame to keep in mind. And he writes, like Jasmine was just talking about, he writes a lot about Harlem, I would say, in his various works. And I'd like to read a short quote from an essay in Notes of a Native Son, which was published in 1955. This essay is entitled The Harlem Ghetto. All of Harlem is pervaded by a sense of congestion. Rather, like the insistent, maddening, claustrophobic pounding in the skull that comes from trying to breathe in a very small room with all the windows shut. Yet, the white man walking through Harlem is not at all likely to find it sinister or more wretched than any other slum. We'll talk about this as we get more into Sonny's blues, but this sense of being trapped in Harlem is something that really comes up, I think, in Sonny's blues. And also the very last sentence where Baldwin is sort of contesting with how the white man and Black man might view Harlem, but also the world differently, feels really important. Another essay in Notes of a Native Son called Stranger in the Village, and this essay is about him going on a writing trip in this very rural I think it's some Swiss village. And he's writing about, like, he's really noticing how people treat him differently. This is like 1950s Black man traveling alone in this small ski village. And I was really struck by a couple things that he wrote. One thing is as follows: my smile was simply another unheard of phenomenon which allowed them to see my teeth. They did not really see my smile, and I began to think that, should I take to snarling, no one would notice any difference. This, like, sense of alienation from white people, like, it's almost voyeuristic, the way that people are viewing him and how apart he feels, is further highlighted in how he writes a lot of, like, cultural critique and, like, political critique and analysis. And he goes on to write, people are trapped in history and history is trapped in them. Like, he's really aware of how the history of slavery and, like, anti-blackness globally is impacting the way that people are seeing him. And he writes about it in such, like, this very visceral way, where rage is very much part of, like, the large spectrum of feelings that he's experiencing. He goes on to say, this hegemonic culture, he says, whose culture controls me, has even, in a sense, created me. People who have cost me more in anguish and rage than they will ever know, who yet do not even know of my existence. And I think that he's really getting at how rage is inevitable when you are experiencing this level of disenfranchisement, oppression, and, like, really terrible and like these conditions of suffering. Like, of course you're going to feel rage and contempt, which then Baldwin writes about how he views his job as a writer and a black man. And he really succinctly puts it as his job is to rob the white man of the jewel of his naivete, or else make it cost him dearly. That is his great endeavor, it seems like, in his writing. It's to rob the white man of the jewel of his naivete, and if he doesn't give it up, then make it cost him. And Baldwin writes really, like, he writes in a very confronting way about how black people and white people relate to one another. And he goes on to say, it is one of the ironies of black-white relations that by means of what the white man imagines the black man to be, the black man is enabled to know who the white man is. That is so well put, you know? Like, he's able to kind of, like, get into the mind of and the projections of, like, white people and understand what it is that their value systems are. And the final essay that I want to highlight in Notes of a Native Son, really just to, like, give you a better picture of, like, who Baldwin was through his writing. And this is all of his, like, nonfiction writing, and then we'll get into Sonny's Blues, which is fiction. But Baldwin, again, like, he talks about himself as a writer, and he says, but it is part of the business of a writer, as I see it, to examine attitudes, to go beneath the surface, to tap the source. Jasmine, I wonder, what do you think the source is in this quote?
Maybe the source is something like the human condition. something that lives in the underbelly or underneath the surface in all of us. Maybe more broadly, it could be about the shared and sometimes contradictory experiences that make us feel human, like love and loss and suffering and joy and the constant yearning or searching for meaning in life. Whatever it means to have universal truths about being human, both individually and collectively, that thing that English professors love to hammer home about the shared core of life or whatever, the thing that all of us, or most writers, hope to touch in their work. But maybe in this case, the source goes even deeper and focuses on how there are things like race that shapes the human condition in real ways. There are lived experiences and lived differences that are due to systemic racism, discrimination, and violence, and that there are these disparities in like mental and physical well-being because of it, and how these power dynamics can make marginalized groups feel invisible or secondary or even non-human, or how privilege creates fundamental differences in lived experiences and human conditions, and how it allows others to move through life without having to confront these realities. How ignorance is also kind of a privilege that directly harms marginalized people and the conditions that marginalized people are forced to endure. And maybe the source is also about confronting all of this under the broad scope of the human condition. So what do you think the source is in this quote?
Yeah, I think that the source, it reminds me of how Angela Davis defines radical, which is simply the root that is radical. And when you think about like radical change versus like incremental, potentially, radical is like to grab it by the roots and pull it out. And I think that's also maybe what Baldwin is talking about here. It's to get to what is radical, like what is at the root, like what is the underlying like connective network that can help us like understand things more richly, more deeply. And I think that he really sees it as part of his social responsibility as a writer to illuminate these things, to rob, those who are prejudiced, those who are white, of the jewel of their naivete. Like, that's, it feels like to me, like that is the source. The last thing I'll say about, some of these nonfiction essays that I'm pulling from is how Baldwin contests with even like being a successful writer. And I'll go ahead and read his own words. I brought to Shakespeare, Bach, Rembrandt, the stones of Paris, to the cathedral at Chartres, to the Empire State Building, a special attitude. These were not really my creations. They did not contain my history. I might search in vain forever for any reflection of myself. I was an interloper. this was not my heritage. I would have to appropriate these white centuries. I would make them mine. I would have to accept my special attitude, my special place in this scheme. Otherwise, I would have no place in any scheme. And this is from Autobiographical Notes, from Notes of a Native Son. He is really needing to find and create his own place as an artist and as a writer. Almost, creating a new tradition of writing, a place for himself, but also there's this quote that I see by Baldwin often where it's like, oh, you feel so alone in this world, and then you read like Dostoevsky and realize that like we've all been suffering, and I think that he's saying like, I have to reach in to these white artists and this culture and find the thing that I can keep, understanding that it is not truly mine, but I'll make it mine and I'll make a place for myself as a writer. And I think that he did exactly that. Hopefully that gives you a larger picture, but also brings you closer to who Baldwin was, what his legacy is, and what his worldview, what his responsibility as a writer is, to situate you before we get into talking about Sonny's Blues. So, Jasmine, with all that being said, can you give us a synopsis of Sonny's Blues?
So this story was written in Paris and published in 1957. It follows an unnamed narrator who learns from the newspaper that his younger brother Sonny has been arrested for dealing heroin. He works as a high school algebra teacher in Harlem, and as he looks at all his students, he can't help but think that any of them might be struggling the same way Sonny is, using drugs to cope with the pain of being a young black man in Jim Crow America. On his way home, the narrator runs into one of Sonny's old friends who's also addicted to drugs, and their conversation makes the narrator realize how hard prison will be for Sonny, even though he claims that he's not really going to help his brother. It's not only like months later, after the narrator's daughter dies of polio, that he finally reaches out to Sonny in jail. They begin writing to each other, and when Sonny is released, he comes to live with the narrator and his family. And of course, this reunion of Sonny's return, it brings up memories from their past. The narrator is reminiscing and remembering about his mother making him promise to protect Sonny after the death of their father. She warned him how dangerous the world could be, especially for black men and sensitive black men like Sonny. She tells him about how his father had watched his brother, also a musician like Sonny, get run over by a car by drunk white men, and that the world really hasn't changed since. As a teenager, Sonny wanted to be a jazz musician, but the narrator strongly discouraged him, and their relationship grew more strained over time, especially after the death of their mother and the narrator's furlough to the army. Sonny eventually joins the Navy, and then there are years of silence and distance between them until Sonny's arrest. Back in the present, after just 2 weeks of living together, Sonny asks the narrator to come hear him play at a nightclub that night. The narrator agrees, and they have this conversation, this really intense conversation about how overwhelming suffering can be and how both drugs and music can become ways to escape it or survive it without falling apart. And Sonny explains that even though he's clean now, the struggles are still there, they're not magically gone, that he still experiences suffering and troubles. And the narrator doesn't say it out loud, but he promises to always support Sonny. That night, they go to the nightclub, and the narrator is so surprised by how respected Sonny is, how everyone knows him, and it becomes clear that Sonny has this whole world, this whole life and community that the narrator didn't even really know or understand or try to understand about. And as Sonny and the band start playing, the narrator kind of has this moment where he realizes just how hard it must be for musicians to take all this emotion, all this pain and joy and anger and confusion that people carry daily and turn it into something meaningful and beautiful and a shared experience through music. During the performance, Sonny's hesitant, but he finally loses himself in the music, and the narrator is just in awe a little bit. He realizes that music tells everyone's stories all at once, and also reminds everyone that listening that they're not alone. During a break in the performance, the narrator ends up buying Sonny a drink, and the bartender sets it on top of the piano. Sonny takes a sip. He shares a look with his brother and begins playing again. And finally, the story ends as the narrator watches the glass trembling on the piano.
Yeah, I think the ending scene, the glass trembling on the piano, was really memorable. What's notable here is that Baldwin is the oldest of 9 siblings. So I think that him writing about this older brother, younger brother relationship was probably something that he thought quite a lot about in his own life. And I really liked the tension, the texture, what wasn't said between the brothers. And you can see that, like, we follow the characters through actually quite a long period of time, I would say, for a short story particularly. Like, this is not a short story that's a snapshot of a moment. This is a short story that spans through, like, I don't know, 15, if not 20 years, maybe. Like, we go through a lot with these characters and see their relationship at many different points. And there was this moment that the older brother thinks to himself, and he says, "This was because I had begun, finally, to wonder about Sonny, about the life that Sonny lived inside." And that really struck me, because it's like, you know, he had gone so long just Sonny being his younger brother, and hadn't really thought about Sonny as like a totally autonomous individual person outside of himself and outside of his family. And then he begins looking at Sonny differently and understanding Sonny differently. And he's really reflective about how, you know, this older brother, younger brother dynamic separates them. And the character, the unnamed older brother, wonders, "The 7 years difference in our ages lay between us like a chasm. I wondered if these years would ever operate between us like a bridge." Like, there's something about this older brother having this responsibility and age that really distances him from Sonny, but he's like really yearning for and wanting connection with him, but not quite knowing how to do it. And it's like, it seems like when Sonny was a baby, that was like the most pure, easy connection that they had. And the unnamed narrator writes, or he thinks, Baldwin writes, the narrator thinks, when he started to walk, he being Sonny, he walked from our mother straight to me. I caught him just before he fell, when he took the first steps he ever took in this world. It's so tender, and there's something like so parental about their bond, something so deep and connective. And yet, we start the story in a very disconnected place. We start with the unnamed narrator sitting on the subway with like these rocking lights, just like going to work and thinking about how he doesn't even understand how Sonny's life got to this point of becoming incarcerated and using drugs and feeling like he wants nothing to do with it almost. But there's like this undercurrent of extreme tenderness and care that's there.
When we first encounter the narrator and Sonny, there's a lot of friction. They're kind of on tiptoes with each other, although I think it's more like the narrator is tiptoeing, not Sonny. But you're so right that even through this discomfort, there's this undercurrent of care and tenderness between the two. They'd been separated for years, and then they started writing to each other, and then they suddenly started living together. They're navigating this uneasy relationship that's punctuated by all of these things that are unsaid but also known in their relationship. There's these roles that they both kind of fall into, and I think that it definitely started in the beginning at home with their mother. Just before she dies, she asks the narrator to take care of Sonny, to not leave him alone no matter what. And this kind of cements their dynamic as someone who cares for and someone who is cared for. Someone who acts and someone who looks out. Maybe that's not accurate, but the essence may be. I think that their mother knew that her youngest son may need like a stable rock to ground himself a bit, and she saw that the narrator had that potential to be that for Sonny, because ultimately she knows how heavy life in Harlem can be and how dangerous it is for young black men, especially young black men who feel as intensely as Sonny, not just in Harlem, but in America, especially during this time. When she tells the story about her husband's brother being killed by those drunk white men, it's not just a memory, it's kind of like a warning. She's trying to make the narrator understand how vulnerable people like Sonny are and how important it is to hold on to family in this racist, hostile world. And this story is told from Sonny's older brother's point of view, and he's a math teacher who's worked really hard to create a stable and structured life for himself. I mean, as safe as one can be in Jim Crow America. And I think that the narrator, he really values order and responsibility, and he clashes with Sonny because Sonny's not like that at all. He feels more intensely, he acts more wildly, and the narrator, I think, does want to protect Sonny, but the only way he knows how to do it is by trying to shut down what he sees as, like, risky behavior or not responsible behavior. And I think he believes this is why his mother trusted him with Sonny in the first place, because he's like the steady one. He's the harbor for Sonny. And I mean, I think the narrator sees himself as someone who has this to offer Sonny, but I think that it can be really stifling for someone like Sonny to be at the receiving end of it. I think that the narrator has bought into the idea of discipline and conformity, but he's still so miserable. Like, it didn't give him anything more than what his parents had. He's still living in Harlem, living in the projects, stuck in this cycle that he thinks doesn't touch him. But actually, he's in the thick of it. Sonny chooses music. He chooses to chase a life that he wants, even though it comes with real risks. And maybe the narrator sees Sonny as, like, this rebellious kid. But Sonny isn't acting this way, isn't rebelling just because. Like, Sonny is such a deeply emotional and sensitive person. He's just trying to deal with his pain through music or drugs, and the narrator just doesn't get it at all. So I think that while it's clear that the narrator does feel a sense of obligation towards Sonny certainly doesn't have that same obligation back, that same burden of responsibility. But, like, ultimately, Sonny needs his brother too, or at least he needs the harbor, the compassion that he provides while he gets back on his feet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, our unnamed narrator is a bit stifled and repressed, and Sonny is very exuberant and just like ready to experience the world and emotions. And they have quite the contrast, like when they're together. And there's this moment that we're able to see how Sonny is feeling about being in this relationship with his older brother. And Sonny, this is like when Sonny's like an older teenager and their mom had just passed away, and they're like in the kitchen with one another, and Sonny says, as he's smoking, "I just wanted to see if I'd have the courage to smoke in front of you." And I thought that was so tender and interesting. Like, there's something about Sonny looking to his older brother and being a bit nervous about his approval, or being nervous about what his older brother might think of him. And it isn't until maybe the very end of the story where our unnamed narrator is in what he calls, quote unquote, Sonny's kingdom, which is in this like blues club, you know. And he's starting to see Sonny more fully and understand him more fully, I think. Because this whole time, Sonny wants to be a blues musician, and he's really dedicated to it. But our unnamed narrator feels like it's too funky to do that kind of stuff. It's too out there. You need to do something more practical. And it isn't until they walk into this club together and the older brother sees everyone knows Sonny, and Sonny's doing so well up on stage, and he's like, wow, and buys him a drink. And that's really special, because I feel like Sonny's kind of like had to be a little bit smushed to conform into the older brother's world in a lot of ways. And now the older brother's like literally stepping out of his world into this club to see Sonny in a different way. And there's this one line in the story that I think really sums up how the brothers maybe feel towards one another but can't say, which is, "You're going to need me, baby, one of these cold, rainy days." And it's as if this is what they always wanted to say to each other, but they couldn't quite get there. Yeah, yeah, but they have a really important relationship and bond, and there's so much that isn't said between them, which makes it really kind of a pleasure to read about their relationship. I think in Baldwin's fiction, he's really able to have this like strong characterization of both of these, this older brother, younger brother, and write about their relationship in a really compelling way. And I think that one thing that really sets apart the brothers is the way that they experience and conceptualize suffering. Suffering and how people relate to it is a really central part of this story. So that's what we want to talk about next. Sonny is described as a person with a lot of suffering. It's like he's always trying to figure out an outlet for this suffering. And sometimes it was drugs, and sometimes it was music.
Sonny, I think, is a character that is so passionate and feels so intensely and cannot possibly bear to stamp any of it down on his own, and I think that makes him so interesting and admirable, but I think it also makes him like vulnerable to vices and risks. Sonny explains that that his heroin usage is an attempt to cope with suffering that would otherwise overwhelm and consume him. And when he talks about doing drugs, he describes them as making him feel distant and in control and something that you feel like you need just to get through. And I think that for Sonny, drugs become a way to escape the feeling of pain and despair. But of course, like, that escape is so temporary, and his addiction only deepens his suffering because it eventually leads to his incarceration. And even after he gets clean, Sonny, he's still constantly fighting despair, the suffering that he feels, I think. He uses music as a means of resisting it. I think he's lonely, and even though he seems kind of distant, he wasn't understood, not by his brother growing up, and there may have been love and responsibility in their family, but there wasn't real connection, which is what maybe the music is trying to serve or remedy. For Sonny, I think that jazz music and playing the piano is something that he needs in order to survive. And in the final club scene, I think that the narrator finally gets it. Like, through Sonny's performance, the narrator sees or feels all of the emotions he couldn't access before, the pain, fear, and longing, which Sonny could feel but couldn't necessarily put into words. The narrator, on the other hand, the narrator is really defined by restraint, by avoidance. He's so fully aware of the violence, the addiction, and the limitations surrounding him. And he's spent his whole life doing everything he can to avoid the suffering. He has a stable job, he has a family, he's carefully structured his life, but even though he thinks he's maybe outside of all, maybe even outside the suffering, I think he knows that he's still stuck in it. And that makes him like bitter. And the more he tries to control it, the more unhappy he becomes. So on the outside, it may look like he's doing really well, but I think he's just barely coping by. Over time, though, I think he really starts to see alternatives by listening to Sonny's music. He begins to see music not as like the irresponsible youngster distraction, but as Sonny's way of staying alive. And he really gets it when he witnesses Sonny's performance at the club and understands that music is Sonny's redemption and salvation and saving grace, and it opens him up to just feeling whatever Sonny is putting down in the performance.
Yeah, I think that our unnamed narrator, the way that he relates to and conceptualizes suffering is by dissociating from it and creating quite a lot of distance between himself and suffering. When he finds out about Sonny, he's reading like the newspaper and sees that it's his brother that was like busted and is going to be incarcerated. He thinks, I couldn't believe it. But what I mean by that is I couldn't find any room for it anywhere inside of me. I had kept it outside me for a long time. I hadn't wanted to know. He maybe had noticed Sonny slipping further and further into his drug use, but didn't want to see it for what was happening. And he literally had to keep this suffering, this knowledge that his brother was suffering, outside of him. Like there was no room inside of him to hold it. He had to have it outside of his body. And in this scene, it's sort of like I spoke about it briefly earlier, but he's on the subway and he's just sort of like looking at all of the faces in like reflected in the dark subway windows, and it's all just very dissociative and dreamy almost. I think that the relationship between suffering and the community that they live in, so he's, the narrator's still living and working in Harlem, and that's where he grew up. And now he's a school teacher in that same community, living in similar housing projects that he grew up in, but still feels like the suffering is outside of him. Like it's around him, but he feels like he got out of the suffering, even though he's still in Harlem. Whereas he sees that the suffering has followed Sonny wherever he went. And the suffering that he's talking about is like the suffering of living in like a impoverished or disenfranchised neighborhood. And he sees that like Sonny has brought that wherever he is gone, even though the narrator stayed, but still doesn't feel like it touches like this deeper part of him. Because I think the way that the narrator deals with suffering is by dissociating from it. And there's this scene where they both are in this cab, kind of looking at, they're driving by their old neighborhood, and they're the narrator's thinking about how some people escape the trap of living in this neighborhood, but something always gets left behind, like an animal whose leg gets stuck in a trap and it becomes amputated. And he said that I escaped because he was a school teacher. And that is what allowed him to escape, is like this upward social mobility. But Sonny, he hadn't lived in Harlem for years, but it's like still that suffering felt very deep and integral to almost like the person that he was. And I think this part was really profound, where he said, "It came to me that what we both were seeking through our separate cab windows was that part of ourselves which had been left behind in this neighborhood that they both grew up in."
Yeah. I mean, it always surprises me how the same environment can breed like such different people. I think about it all the time in reference to me and my sister. But the place that Sonny and the narrator come from, that suffering is so intense and so inevitable. It's baked in through white supremacy and systemic racism and everything that comes with all these trappings. And it touches everything from the characters and their family history and also their entire community in Harlem. And the story doesn't shy away from the suffering symptoms of it all. But I think more than that, it really contends with the treatment or the coping with the suffering. The narrator, he tried to ignore his pain, but it didn't work. And in contrast, Sonny, he tried to medicate the pain with drugs, and the result was not good at all. But he's also is trying to treat the suffering with music, which instead of numbing the suffering or trying to make it smaller, it actually made the suffering maybe a little bit lighter by sharing that burden, by maybe naming that suffering, making it the heart of his art. And even though there's no easy resolution or happy ending, the connection and recognition they come to with each other, with all the other people in the room listening to music, I think that's very profound and hopeful.
Yeah, there's this conversation towards the end of the story where Sonny and our unnamed narrator are talking about how much suffering there is in the world. And Sonny, it's kind of like the unnamed narrator confronting Sonny a little bit. Like, why do you have to use drugs? Why are you doing this? I don't understand. Why do you have to deal with suffering like this? And Sonny is trying to explain that it makes him feel in control, warm, cold, distant, but also out of the world, but more in it too. Like all of these dichotomies, Sonny's like, when I'm using, I feel all of those things. And for me, that's a way to almost in a way get like, he's trying not to feel the suffering as sharply. And he says everyone tries to not feel their suffering. It's just not the way that you might. Like you might, he's trying to explain to his brother, like you deal with suffering too, just in a different way. And the unnamed narrator says, sure, people can deal with suffering in any kind of way, but I don't want you to deal with suffering in this way because I'm worried for you. Like I don't want to lose you. And Sonny goes back to just talking about how it's so terrible to try to exist. There's so much heaviness and sadness and grief that he feels. And how using like helps him get through it. And it's the most honest, I think, that they were with each other, maybe in their whole relationship so far, is this like one open conversation. Just like, why are you doing this? Here's why I'm doing it. You don't understand. No, you don't understand. And I feel like there is something that's shifting slowly in the older brother, where he's having more compassion actually for his younger brother, for his version of suffering, for how he deals with his suffering, and understanding that like maybe the narrator himself has more suffering than he originally thought. And towards the end, as the unnamed narrator is watching his brother perform on stage, it's almost like something unlocks in him a little bit. And he's pondering to himself these things. In order to find new ways to make us listen, for a while, the tale of how we suffer and how we are delighted and how we may triumph is never new. It always must be heard. There isn't any other tale to tell. It's the only light we've got in all this darkness. And I think that the unnamed narrator is coming to have a deeper appreciation for how Sonny processes his pain, which is through his music. He's seeing his younger brother perform for maybe one of the first times, and he finally is understanding that this is the stuff. This is like some of the most important stuff there is, maybe. And potentially, this is all we have, is to tell our stories. And that, like, in the act of telling, in the act of transmuting suffering into art, whether it's writing or music, that is the only thing that people have, and that is the light in the suffering. He goes on to think, freedom lurked around us, and I understood at last that he could help us to be free if we would listen, that he would never be free until we did. And I think this goes back to how we started our episode, talking about Baldwin's sense of social responsibility as a writer, which is to be confronting, to maybe transmute his own pain and suffering that he's experienced in his life. And that freedom for Baldwin too is like the key to freedom, at least, is to be heard. Like Baldwin himself, through his writing, can help us be free if we listen to him, and therefore will also free him by doing that. There is so much that we can learn from reading and listening to Baldwin. And I think he says it really well, that freedom is sort of all around us, and we can help each other be free if we listen to each other. What a simple but difficult task to do. And I think that Baldwin is such an incredible writer. I love his prose. It like really draws you in, and it really, comments on the human condition in a way that feels so universally relatable, while still also pushing you to consider things in a way that might feel kind of uncomfortable at times. He does such a great job at it. There's so much we can learn from his nonfiction, his fiction, his essays, his speeches, his debates, and I really enjoyed being able to spend some more time with his work in doing this episode. So we hope that you enjoyed this episode, and we will see you next time on the Critical Edition podcast.